The hardest part of any new endeavor is taking that first leap of faith. You gotta start ugly. So often we spend so much time gathering information and procrastinating for fear of how we will be judged. But we cannot complete the journey, reach the summit, or achieve our dreams until we get going. Starting ugly is that first step. Listen, no one looks good doing something for the first time. Whether learning to ride a bike or start a business, it will take time to become good, and even more time to become great. That means putting in the reps, taking action. That action leads to opportunity, and opportunity leads to improvement. Improvement leads to success, and success leads to fortune. Krimitsos is not only the definition of starting ugly. He wrote the book. Chris learned this firsthand after leaving TV production and starting his own business development group in Tampa, Florida. Starting ugly, he would meet with anyone who asked. Filling his calendar with meetings, masterminds, and milestones, Chris quickly became known as the source for business and real estate development in Central Florida. And that's just the beginning. From there, Chris launched his own podcast, helped his wife with hers, and now helps countless others realize their own dreams and goals. And one of those countless others is me. Chris personally changed my life with his last live Podfest event back in February. Established in 2015, Podfest gave podcasters like me a sense of community and a conference to network and grow. That event marked a major turning point for me personally and this podcast. Hosted in Orlando, Florida, Podfest provided me with connections and created relationships that continue to grow to this day. These relationships have further provided information, interviews, and introspection on how to make this podcast better. I'm still applying the new concepts and systems that I learned from that experience over 9 months ago. Chris has changed the industry of podcasting and united a group of incredibly talented people. He's changed the path of the Extraordinary podcast in more ways than I can count. I will forever be in his debt. Be sure to check out his virtual pod and video fests that continue to inspire and educate utilizing digital marketing. Hear how he started ugly, figured it out along the way, and got everything he asked for. I hope you enjoy learning from the man, Chris Krimitsos. This is the Extraordinary Podcast, and my guest today is Chris Krimitsos.
Krimitsos, you said it right. I appreciate it, Nate.
Well, I love the Greek names, and I've had a string of very difficult guest names to pronounce, and I've got a classic run of butchering those names. So I've been practicing yours for a while, pretty much ever since podcast. So if I didn't get it right, then I have no hope left for me at this point. How's it going? How's Tampa?
Tampa's amazing. I'm a former New Yorker, moved to Tampa 15 years ago. So I love it here. It's been a great time watching my two little girls grow up, and just love the city. You know, the city embraced me when I first moved here. So I've always enjoyed the city of Tampa and the people.
Yeah, and I'm really looking forward to talking about your roots in Tampa and how you kind of established some of your groups that you started there before we get into all of this. But first, let's tell everybody how we all know Chris. Because it didn't start off that way. You were known in the business world. You were a business guy, real estate, all that kind of stuff. But for about a decade, you have become the face of a new industry kind of thing. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So a decade would be the right thing. So I broke into television production in 05, 06, public access. We produced shows, had a lot of fun. And we were doing social media classes. And back then, social media had just started. And I featured a young guy by the name of Gary Vaynerchuk. He came out and spoke for us. No one knew who he was. He wasn't Gary V yet. He would pronounce his name Gary Vaynerchuk. And I remember he was probably one of the only people that could understand what was going on. I really related to him because I was teaching all this stuff on the ground level. But one thing I remember about that was he didn't know what his next move was. His dad had a wine store, and what a lot of people don't realize, is he set out on his own and he was branding his name and he was trying to figure out what he was going to be. For everybody that knows him now, it was obvious at the time he probably would have had a marketing agency, but at the time for him, it wasn't obvious. He was going to open up a venture capital firm, invest in stocks. He had all these different choices he could have taken. And I remember very short order watching him literally build what is now VaynerMedia and the empire. But I remember he was in that crossroads when I met him. The one thing I recall and the lesson I learned from that was he saw the opportunity of social media when it first started as a national, international opportunity. I saw it as a local opportunity. And what I realized was his timing was spot on. My timing was spot on, but my strategy was off. His strategy was right on the money. So my strategy was off in that I went local with something that could have been international. So I promised myself, and you'll appreciate this, Nate, I said, next time I see something that has universal application, and since I'm an early adapter, which I didn't realize that about myself at the time, I'm going to make sure to help as many people as I can. And I'm not going to restrict it to a local geographic area. Well, in 2013, we had a gentleman talk about podcasting. I already knew a little bit about podcasting, but at the end, his name is Steve Cherubino. At the end of that meetup, we were hanging out. I had 13 people that joined us that day. And it's just me and him. And I said, how many people you got listening to your show? And he did this show called Android App Addicts. They would talk about Android apps. He goes, yeah, about 4,000. And I'm like, is that yearly, monthly? I had no idea about numbers. He goes, yeah, like every week. I go, you producing like 10, 20 shows a week? He goes, no, one. And I was like dumbfounded. I was stunned. And he goes, yeah, in my expression, he said to me, yeah, I know, I'm trying to get my numbers up. I go, numbers up? You got 4,000 people listening to what's coming out of your mouth at home about Android apps? He goes, yeah. I go, dude, I just spent all month to get 13 people in a room. What are you talking about? You go home and you got 4,000 people. So it was an epiphany for me that this thing called podcasting was beginning to really reach critical mass. But I knew a couple things about myself because of the Gary Vaynerchuk case study. I'm always ahead of the trend, even though I think I'm behind the trend. And there's always room for it to grow. So that's when we created PodFest. We actually did 2 workshops in Florida, helping our friends. So I'm a very big collaborator. So like Nate, if you're in my local area, I'm like, I want Nate to know, I want all these friends that I have. So we did 2 workshops. They each had about 75, 80 people each. And of those 2 workshops, I would say 25 people became full-time podcasters. And when I say full-time, like their podcast hit, like with huge audiences. So for me, that was all I needed to see. And the next year we created PodFest, and we have doubled in size year over year. We moved it from Tampa to Orlando because, like I told you, I made the promise to myself I would not restrict it. So Orlando or Vegas was really the right choice because those are convention cities. And people, this is what the one thing I learned. I know it sounds obvious to a lot of people, but if you're trying to have a really big conference, if you're in one of those cities, your conference is actually going to have a much higher growth rate because the spouses of your attendees want to go to those cities as well for many other reasons. So it becomes a very easy decision for the family. And when you're talking about people traveling for 3 or 4 days, you want to be in a city that kind of draws the family, or the spouse, or, whatever it is. So that was my start, and that kind of put me into the spotlight. I love podcasting. I love really online media like that. I just love the fact that there's no one controlling what we do. The decentralized nature really appeals to me.
Yeah, I love the fact that it is totally free form, and it can be as bad or as good as you want it to ultimately be. And there's no one out there dictating any of that. Well, before I go into the whole group, I love how the groups moved into the podcast, and I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that. But I would completely be remiss if I didn't take just a minute to talk about PodFest and the influence and the impact that it's had on me personally and this show. And, I've been preparing for this interview and listening to some of your other interviews you've done with other people. And it's always so rewarding to hear those impact stories and to hear about how things that you've done along the way. And that's one of the reasons why I do this podcast, because I get to have some of that thrown back at me. But I just have to tell you, PodFest this year, the difference that has made in just those, what has it been, 6-9 months since that, what would be in end of February, beginning March? I'm going to name them out. Pablo Gonzalez, number one, first and foremost, chief executive connector. Jeremy Siegel, who also interviewed you as well, the Why Influence podcast. Walker Neer, the Walk Show podcast. Carolyn Owens, coaching with Let's Coach with Carolyn. And there's about 6 or 7 more that I'd really like to dive into. But I just got to say that the impact that I didn't know any of those people. I was out here on my island trying to figure out where in the world this is going to go. What is this? I mean, because I don't come from the podcasting background like you. This is all new to me. And that weekend, the very first time I met Pablo, he just came up to me and just started talking to me. And then I got to have the experience, and then getting to work with Jeannie and your crew and getting to see the impact that those guys were having. It absolutely just completely changed the game for me. It completely changed my outlook. It changed the way that I saw podcasting. It changed the opportunities that I was aware of. And most importantly, like, it made me feel like, okay, I have a home here. Like, these are my people. And when you see these win-win connections and I came off of that weekend just on a high, it was just like, okay, now we got to get to work. Now we see some things that are going to be happening. And I just have to tell you, man, it absolutely changed my life.
Listen, I saw you in the sitting in those chairs where you were doing interviews nonstop. It was awesome to see you buzzing in the hallways. But one thing I've always wanted was a place where we could all feel at home. And, we all come from different backgrounds. We all have just a lot of cool differences, but how cool would it be that we're all accepting of each other and we all support and help each other. So that's what PodFest represents. And I've gone to a lot of conferences in this space, and a lot of them have a lot of hierarchies, like, oh, this is a big person. And that I wanted to shatter the hierarchical structure and just make an environment where everybody feels welcome. And I'm glad that you're telling me that, because that's our objective.
Yeah, it had that Comic-Con kind of feel to it, where it's like you're just part of the crowd, like you're all here together. We're all this one big family. It wasn't like you have like these upper echelons of folks that are like the podcast superstars that we're all bowing down to. It was like, no, this is a community of all of us trying to figure out, and the support that I personally got from those people at that event, it blew my mind. I still reel from that experience. But the game has changed since then. Right after that event, the world changed. We got smacked in the face with this nightmare that we're all living in now. And certainly for somebody like you, that's a huge game changer. When your life is in-person events and that's all that to have that world just collapse had to be devastating. I mean, obviously it was great to be coming off of the big, huge win that was PodFest, but what was that experience like, coming from such a high to now having to deal with some really unique set of circumstances?
Well, as you know, our big event happened right before the cutoff. I think a week later, the country shut down.
Yeah, the next event scheduled for that hotel did not happen.
Yeah, nothing happened actually. We were literally the last in that hotel for a while, and then so I knew it was going to happen while we were doing PodFest. Like, I knew we were either going to be shut down or we were going to be the last for the year.
Yeah, at that point, you weren't even sure if that event was going to even kick off.
Right. Yeah. So we went from,
dicey.
I mean, you might know this, but we went from, the hotel was not only full, it was overflowed, when we had to have a second hotel, to the night before you could get any room you wanted when PodFest happened. Now our people had rooms, but it was crazy how fast that turned. And then when it was all over with, I knew, like, I appreciate every moment, because I was like, we're not going to be in a big room of people for quite some time. I didn't realize it would be as long as it is now. I thought maybe 6 months.
That's kind of
maybe
what I was
towards the end
thinking
of the
too.
year. I didn't think it would be a full year and a half, which is what it's looking like. From January to probably June will be when the events come back, which we'll have our event when everybody comes back. But In the meantime, I started a support group for all my friends who had events planned out for the rest of the year. I got them on a Facebook group to see how we could help disseminate information.
How
So right
typical
away,
is that? Can I just say? I mean, what is what does Chris do when the crisis hits? He starts a group.
well, I
Gets
felt
an organization going.
I felt a level of responsibility since I was fortunate enough to have my event go on. I invited my competitors. I invited anyone that wanted help to see how we could source help. As you know, at Podfest, we had to create protocols before there were protocols of like, do you touch someone? No touching. So we were creating those policies right up front so people felt comfortable. Luckily for us, though, no one really, from what I can tell, got coronavirus from our group, which is amazing. Then I thought to myself, okay, well, I got to do a virtual event, and I stalled on it, and I did my first one-day event in May, which sounds like very quickly, but for me, I work a lot quicker, as you know. So I was like, let me do a one-day test. I think it was May 16th, something like that. We did the one-day test. It went over really well, and that gave me the confidence to see that, okay, because I didn't know where people were at too, like personally, like, when you're promoting and whatever economic forces, that's great. But when you have like a plague or something, it's different.
Yeah,
It's different.
like nobody knows what the rules are going to be at that point, or like
not
how it's
only
all
the
going to
rules,
shake
but
out.
you don't know what people are going through. You don't want to be too presumptuous of like, hey,
Yeah.
let's learn podcasting when someone's trying to feed their family. So you're just trying to gauge what people need. So then that was a success. And I was bragging to a friend of mine, Gabe Eloisi. I was like, hey, we're going to do another one probably in the summertime. And he said, you should call the Guinness World Records. And in between that time, my daughter was watching this show called Sing with a koala bear played by voiced by Matthew McConaughey.
I have three daughters. I know it very well.
So well, so I'm watching it, and I've watched it hundreds of times, but for whatever reason it hit me because, like you said, I was going through this
They were going through
of
the
no
same
live
thing.
events.
Yeah.
And in Sing, they're going through the same exact thing. His theater collapses. Then he's got to, and I was crying because all my friends had just lost their theater, so to speak, their events. But he made the best of it. And that's when I said, okay, let's do something. That's when we created Podfest Global. And luckily Guinness World Records certified it. They said, okay, we'll back you. We'll give you the logo. You guys could certify it. And then we were very fortunate. We set the Guinness World Record by 3. So they set the record very high at 5,000 attendees, and we had 5,000. We had well over that, but we had to hire a forensics accountant team to go look through the numbers. And when it was all said and done, all the duplicates were taken out. Speakers, there's certain rules like I didn't pay attention, to be honest with you, to the details.
Right.
And when the fine details started coming through, we got it by 3. So we made it by 5,003 people. So we set a Guinness World Record in the process, which put wind in the sails of the whole community.
Well, and in all reality, I mean, Guinness record aside, that was the first real large virtual event in the podcasting space. Yep. And to see how this is all going to play out. And I can speak to myself and those that were in attendance. It was a huge success in the fact of just the content and the benefit that it brought to the arena, or to the, to this space.
Yeah, and you mentioned this. We're like Comic-Con. Our community provides the content, so we had no celebrity. Like we actually you'll love this, Nate. So my wife goes, "We should get some celebrities." I said, "You know what, Katie? If the community brings the celebrities, we'll get them. But I'm not going to go out of my way." Last minute, one of our attendees like, "Hey, I could get Gabrielle Reese to come talk." I'm like, "Great, yeah. I could get it." So it was like, I said, "You see that?" She goes, "Wow, that's crazy." I go, "The community will provide everything we need. We just got to believe in our community." And then most of the speakers, I mean, we had over 320 were from our community. Yeah. And then we were all pushing together. So it was a bunch
of my buddies. Isar Matisse was one of them. Yeah.
Yeah. Isar is amazing. Yeah. So, it was, we all came together and we made it happen, and we'll be doing that again next year. So we're looking so what the community has told me is like, hey, we want to break our old record and set it so high no one else can get it. So I'm like, I'm down with that. That'll be fun.
Yeah, that's a win-win. Well, that's one of the things I love about all of this, and Podfest in particular, and in the arena or the industry of podcasting, if you will. It's all those win-win opportunities. There's so many opportunities to help each other out and to provide these mutually beneficial relationships that I just love so much. But I want to talk about, we're talking about Podfest now and how wonderful and huge it is and how it's turned into this big thing. But it didn't start off that way for you. You start off really this kind of a community involvement or community development. I guess it would be a best way to describe it. And I'm trying to do that. So now a lot of the questions I'm going to ask you are kind of personal for me and what I'm trying to follow in your footsteps and kind of do some of the things that you're doing. So virtually and in person, what advice would you have for me? Because I've started my extraordinary group. I've got my Facebook group up and it's not really gaining any traction. Haven't done much with it, but it's in place and ready to go. And I also want to leverage the Atlanta community and the podcasting group that's here. Like Jeremy has done an amazing job with his Why Influence group. So what advice would you have for me for getting all of that started? Getting like to those first 10 or 100 people.
Well, yeah, meetup.com has been really pivotal. So if you use these two tools, you could get people to live events or even virtual events, Meetup and Eventbrite. So if you could link up Eventbrite, Meetup, and Facebook events, and you use those three, the main thing is you have to have what's in it for them. So, the written copy has to write, what are they getting when they attend? And then the other mark of success, if you want to bring people together or build a community, is how many one-to-ones have you had with your community members? Very few people do that. So I would literally have one-to-one calls, Zoom calls, 15, 20 minutes. If you could set 30 minutes, that'd be ideal. I used to do 1 hour in-person meetings, but that was, back in the day. Now I'd say 30 minutes is the new 1 hour meeting. And seek to understand, what are they going through? What are their pain points? What do they need help with? And detach your ego of what you want to provide them and listen, and then help them any which way you can. What usually happens, when I started out, I used to have a goal of 20 to 25 one-to-ones a week. And I'd meet physically business owners at a business club. And I would listen to them. I would ask them their story. I would share my story. And if they were a fit for my community, I would ask them if they would like to be part of it. And then I would literally have a form that they'd sign up right then and there if they said yes. If they weren't ready yet, I would just say, how can I help you? If I had a resource, sometimes I would meet someone earlier that week, would be a great connection for someone later in the week. I would send out what's called an e-introduction. And that's a very simple, it would be like, hey, in the header, it'd say, Nate, e-intro to, let's say, Aaron. Nate, I think you should meet Aaron because Aaron's doing X, Y, Z. Aaron, you should meet Nate because Nate's da-da-da. And then it would say, based on these synergies, I think the two of you should get on a call. And then I would say, Nate, meet Aaron, Aaron, meet Nate. And it would have your emails on the bottom. So I would send like 10 introductions a day back in the day. So now what's happened is I've done over 5,000 one-to-ones. Every day of the week, I get an introduction in my inbox because I put so much out to the universe that now it's flooding back to the point where I had a personal assistant used to manage everything. Now I do it and the team works on everything. It could be overwhelming at times, but it's a blessing. I'd rather have that than nothing coming in.
Well, I love that. It's so much about what you put out there. I'm a big believer in that karma, and like what you put out to the universe will come back to you. And I think that's certainly been the case with you as you've seen this happen over the years. I'm doing what you're doing. I'm just not doing it at the scale. When you said 20 to 25 of those a week, I was amazed. I'm getting those and I'm doing the 30-minute calls. And of course, they're all virtual. But I'm certainly not getting those kind of numbers.
Well, that's when I started out and that's all I did, right? That was like my full-time job was, if you're not busy, you must make your schedule fill it up one way or another. Now I'm not doing that now, but I do at least 10, but like I've scaled down.
That's amazing. Yeah, that's still.
Well, it's not because I'm seeking it now. Now it's literally incoming. Like it
right.
comes every day. There, at least there's one or two.
Yeah. I can imagine you're in pretty popular demand these days for sure.
Well, it's creating, being a connector requires some work, but if you put that work into it and you're seen as there's a documentary film. It's a really great story Disney released. It's about a man named Howard Ashman and it's on Disney Plus. And he basically, a lot of people don't remember, but after Walt passed away, the animation department of Disney floundered for quite some time. People don't know this, but in the 80s, Disney didn't really have any. They were just repurposing the old stuff Walt had made, but there was no real leadership. And they found this guy on Broadway who's doing musicals. He did Little Shop of Horrors. He did a couple, and he knew everything about musicals. From a little child, he taught himself about musicals. And Disney, Jeffrey Katzenberg hired him to Disney. And the animation department was strewn across all these trailers. There was no real, you think the name Disney and you're like, oh my God, it's going to be amazing. And it wasn't an amazing area. And Howard came in And I don't even think he had like a big title. He was just there to help the animation department. And what happened was his quiet leadership, people started asking him his feedback on things, to where he became the number one person in the whole animation department, even without a title. And he led the renaissance of Disney in the early 90s. He created The Little Mermaid. He was behind Aladdin, um, The Lion King, like all these movies had his mark. And he also brought Alan Menke to help write the scores. I believe that was but he passed away, unfortunately. But the story is very powerful about leadership doesn't always need a title. You just need to care more than everybody else. And then people cue into that and they'll see that you really care.
Well, I love that idea because it's the same that what I'm trying to do within the podcasting space. It's like just being that resource and being available to people and just providing as much benefit as you can. And if you do that for an extended period of time, then you get perceived as the person to go to seek that advice and to seek that kind of counsel. And that's a great example, like, of what you have become in the podcasting space. Like, that's why I believe so many people go to you as the expert in the field of podcasting.
Yeah, it's an honor. I appreciate that people come to me, and I love working in the space. And now I'm also building out my knowledge in the YouTube space. So that's next, because we have VidFest. So this is the year where I'm going to start really. I've already started delving deep into YouTube. So that's the next phase, is growing my knowledge in the YouTube space.
Perfect, because that's where I need my most help. So you're lining up perfectly for me.
Well, hit me up after this, you and Jeremy. So we'll get on a call. But we're putting on VidFest in December, and I'd love your support with it. We're going to get a lot of great YouTubers together.
Well, Jeremy's doing great with it. He's already ahead of the game. But again, like his weekly call, he's another one that's a great example of putting people into a space where they can network and feed off of one another and get some helpful advice and tips in the process from some guest speakers. It's been a tremendously beneficial weekly meeting for me, for sure. That's a perfect segue into Starting Ugly. So you got into the podcasting space in that manner. Now you're kind of doing the same thing with YouTube, but you have this amazing book, and you did the book through that same process. And the book is called Start Ugly. And well, I'll let you give us that 10,000-foot synopsis of what an amazing book that is.
Well, Start Ugly is a very fundamental principle in life, in that your start, no matter how great it is, it's still an ugly start compared to where you wind up years later. Because you perfectly execute after you've started. So it's just a short parable. It's a story about a gentleman that kind of loses his way and has to be reminded of the principles that he guided him in the beginning of his career. And what we see too often is people get entrenched in their behavior, and they're afraid to start ugly because they're afraid to lose what they've built. But the real thing in today's innovative culture is, like, look at COVID. Everybody had to start ugly. March 16th. I mean, that was like the date. Everything fell off a cliff. So business owners and individuals were asked to start ugly, whether they liked it or not, because whatever their future was yesterday didn't exist on that day moving forward. And then they had to figure their way through. So it's pretty, I mean, look at the restaurant industry. I mean, talk about start ugly. They've had multiple start uglies this year alone.
Survive ugly.
Survive. Yeah, right. Survive ugly and figure it out. But they did, a lot of them did. Not all of them. A lot of them are not going to be around. So Start Ugly is just a principle of innovation, but it's written from a parable format. And I think there's one page where I give some business advice. I give you I have a 7-point checklist there on how to start and what to do.
And I love that you said parable, because that's exactly the best way to describe it. It reminds me of The Richest Man in Babylon, where it's a short, easy read. I read it in one night. I got it that night at Podfest and made it through the whole thing that night. But at the end, you are getting some real world practical tips to say, like, here, like, just go and do it. And I have to tell you, I've given that book away several times now, and I reflect back on it to a lot of the people that I'm coaching through this similar process of not necessarily even coaching, but just in the personal development space. It's just that action that leads.
Yeah, it's very popular in that. A lot of people give it to their friends, or if they're consulting coaching, they'll give it to their clients. Sometimes we can't see ourselves, but through a book, we could kind of identify with a character. So that's what it was created for. Instead of telling you I could give you this book and you might read it and you're like, "Ooh, where can I start ugly? Where am I stuck?" And that helps people that are working with you kind of help you.
I love the idea of sharing knowledge through a story. I mean, that's kind of the theme for this podcast is I don't want anybody sitting here just telling us what to do, but if you can give me some best practices through a shared experience or through a good story, that's always a great way to learn, I feel like. Well, and I want to talk a little bit about you were talking about restaurants, and I have to tell you, I love your Greek heritage. And when I think of the Greek heritage, I think of great restaurants because there's one restaurant in particular. It's the Clock. It's in Greenville, South Carolina, and it's this group of these Greek guys. It's all guys, and they've been there for God, probably 100 years, and they do what they do. They do it well. They still take cash and checks only. They don't even run a credit card process, but they just have their thing. And for some reason, that just resonates with me so well. Do you credit some of your success to that Greek heritage? Do you think that plays a role?
So I talk about my Uncle Gus a lot, but there's one story that I don't share too often. My Uncle Gus, I failed chemistry one year and I had to go to summer school. And during summer school, my Uncle Gus lived right across our high school. So I would take my 10 speed and I'd go over his house. And after summer school, he'd literally give me bags of vegetables. And I'll give you an example. My Uncle Gus lived, he bought his house early on before the values went through the roof. So he had like an acre and a half, which is very unusual where we lived. And he had an orchard literally of like apple trees, cherry tree, like all kinds of stuff. And then he had a garden. And to explain to you how big his garden is, I think it was a third of an acre was his garden. So the work ethic that I was exposed to by seeing my uncle plow literally a third of an acre every year for his garden, and he would give me bags of vegetables to take home to my mom. I just remember years later, I was doing my one-to-ones like I was telling you, meeting people. And this one guy was telling me, yeah, we have a community garden. And he explained, I go, how big is it? Because the way he was explaining is like, we need 10 volunteers. And without the volunteers, we couldn't make it happen. And I asked him, like, how big is it? And he explains to me, and I remember it was like a third of the size of my uncle's garden that he did by himself. He was plowing a third, and he had seasons. He knew when to plant, the squash and the pumpkins. So during October, we'd have pumpkins for Halloween. Then obviously wintertime, he'd winterize everything. He actually even had figs up in New York, which is almost impossible. He'd winterize the trees, be ready for the spring. But when you're exposed to that kind of work ethic, you realize that the human being is capable of quite a lot of output, focused in the right way. And this is a guy that worked like 15 hours a day on top of the fact that he had a garden. His restaurant was down the street. So he'd be at the restaurant when he wasn't home. So he created his own.
Of course, he had a restaurant.
Yeah, he created his own brick oven outdoors so he could make outdoor bread. I mean, old school. I'm talking about like old school. So Uncle Gus he's still around, an amazing human being, but growing up, being exposed to that kind of work ethic kind of teaches you, like, don't take these things for granted and help as many people as you can, because you saw it. I got to see it firsthand with my uncles.
That's amazing. That's a great segue into my next question. So I'm going to actually steal some of your knowledge to my own personal benefit. I have some speaking opportunities later on towards the end of the year. And one of the areas I'm speaking on, it's all within the realm of podcasting, but they wanted to talk about entrepreneurship and how some of those small business principles relate directly and specifically to podcasting. So in helping me write my presentation for me, what would be some advice that you would have on, or some of those small business principles that apply to podcasting specifically?
I mean, podcasting is agnostic, just like a small business, in that you have to figure out how to build your signage first and foremost. So any business has to have good signage to be visible. Podcast cover art, the signage needs to be the first thing you look at. Is what am I? Do you know what you're getting when you read my sign? So what is your logo? What is the words? And then, is it inviting me to come into the place of business? So will I hit the play button to learn what it is about? And then, is it evident that the brand promise is carried out when I start listening to the audio? Very much like once I walk into a store, is it evident that I'm going to get what the sign told me I was going to get when I walk in? So the more congruent you could be, the better. And then, just like stores of today, I mean, most stores cater to niche audiences, And there's only like a handful of brands like Walmart or Target that caters to everybody. But if we actually think about even the brands that cater to everybody, Target caters mostly to upper middle class females. I mean, they know their market, right? And what's their brand promise? You never have to wait online when you're checking it out, and it's clean and it's bigger aisles. Walmart caters to everybody. I mean, but there's only one Walmart. Online, there's only one Amazon. So,
Right.
you have to realize, like, okay, what advantages do I have to compete right now? If you're dealing with an entrepreneurship podcast, for instance, Walmart is already there. It's called John Lee Dumas Entrepreneur on Fire. Let's just say he's the Walmart brand. So what do I have of value that would fit into this ecosystem where people come to hang out in my shelves, if that makes sense?
Makes perfect sense. Going through building your brand and building a podcast, it's the other aspect I'm speaking on at that conference is going to be monetizing your podcast. But I don't want to speak to that specifically. What I want to speak to, because there's a process you have to get to before you're ready to monetize. And so one of the journeys that Jeremy and I are both on a similar path right now is we're at this point where we're beginning to gain some traction, but we're still not at that real legitimized level where where the easy ad opportunities come. So I guess what my question would be is, how do I go from a mid-range podcaster who's seeing some success? I've got what I feel like is a legitimate show. There's some legitimate content. I've got some subscribers. I've got this little base established, but I want to now take it to that level of to where I can ultimately make a living, where we can, be a very profitable, successful organization at that point. How do you go from that mom and pop podcast that's really, filling a niche and you're in your groove, to then being a well-established one that you can now, I guess, quit that 9-to-5 job, if you will?
Well, you got to ask your audience, get feedback, and then you got to figure out what the brand promises of that podcast. So let's go down the line. You also have to understand your timing and what's available for you. So let me give you some examples. My wife created Biz Women Rock 8 years ago, 7 years. It was a long time ago. And at the time, she was the only one of two, maybe only female, interviewing other female leaders. So she was able to build a huge base of listeners. She had 1,000 female listeners, and then she was able to sell consulting. So that was able to fund the business, so to speak, and help grow the podcast. She just transitioned into a meditation podcast. So there's something like 1,100 meditation podcasts. There's a lot. So how did she differentiate, and how is she now one of the biggest in the world within 2 years? She saw three opportunities. One is she made it only for women. So her market, again, is niche right off the bat, but that's believe it or not, that's a very broad niche. We're just discounting half the audience, but the other half qualifies. And then most guided meditations, are named like chakra, whatever really, and she's like, modern day women can't relate to that. So she started naming her titles like dealing with imposter syndrome, dealing with mommy guilt, stuff that women could relate to. So believe it or not,
Nice.
As simple as that sounds, that was a huge strategic advantage. And then the third thing she did was she listened to a bunch of these meditations, and none of them stated the intention before they got into the guided meditation. So she states the intention of the meditation before it starts. So what I'm saying to you, Nate, is if you are in a generalized niche and your name is generalized, then you need to look at format opportunities. Is there a formatting opportunity that no one is fulfilling that you could then create a format opportunity? And then what are the 2 or 3 key things that I get out of listening to your show that I can't really find anywhere else? So we want to avoid being all things to all people. We want to be, the most popular thing, Mitzi Shore, who used to run the Comedy Store, she'd always say this. She said, the most famous people are always polarizing in some way, shape, or form, meaning half the people love them, the other half hate them. Now, I'm not saying you have to do that, but it's knowing what you represent. And if people don't like it, that's okay. As long as the people that love you, go get their friends to come. Dave Ramsey is an example of polarizing figures. He's a male Christian, but that's not why he's polarized. He's polarizing because in his financial information, he's like, pay your debt. Debt is bad. Then you got someone like Robert Kiyosaki saying debt is good. Leverage your debt so you can make money. So like that's a polarizing, those two issues are polarizing within that field. So Dave Ramsey has never veered off that he's the pay your debt guy. He doesn't care. Pay your house off. So, and Robert Kiyosaki, which I relate to because I like taking bigger risks. He's more of the risk guy. Like, what can you risk to get to the other side? Both of them get you where you need financially free, but they're very different.
They're pretty much polar opposites.
Polar opposites, but
much
the objective is the same, to be
Yeah.
financially free, but it's two different ways of getting there,
Oh, that's brilliant. No, that makes perfect sense to me. I love that. That's a great analogy. So real quick, and I'm going to jump into something else. What's the biggest mistake that you see podcasters making? What's the biggest thing that just like you were
They don't do any strategic research into what shows are already in their space. What are the opportunities with keywords on the name of the show, as well as format opportunities, like I said. Sometimes, like, I met a girl up in Washington because I was at another conference, and she was an event planner, and people know I love doing events. So they're like, hey, you should meet Chris, blah, blah, blah. She's like, yeah, I started my event planner podcast and was named after her name or something. It made no sense, whatever the name was. And I said, why didn't you call it, I forgot, let's say her name was Louisa. Why don't you call it Louisa's Event Planning Guide or Event Planning Podcast? She goes, oh, well, event planning, that's in all those others. I go, there's a reason. That's how people search. I go, you just made your show non-searchable and I don't even know what it's about. So you'll never get downloads. And she's like, yeah, I only get 1 or 2. I go, yeah, because I have no idea what it is. I go, who told you it was good? She goes, all my friends. I go, those are the worst people to ask, is family and friends. Unless you're related to someone that's like an expert in the field, I would not ask their expert opinion because they're not experts. And you're just getting an opinion on someone that doesn't know anything. So I'd be very careful. They want to
be supportive too. So
they want to be loving and supportive. So they're going to tell, oh my God, it's so amazing. Oh, congratulations. But you need critical feedback, which is very different than a pat on the back. You're doing great. So I would keywords. And then in Apple iTunes, a lot of people don't realize, but you could hit related. There's a button called related and tells you what podcast listeners are related to that show. And that's how you could do really quick on the fly keyword research. 3 examples I love to give of case studies. Gary Vaynerchuk used to talk about wine. Then he talked about social media. Now he's the entrepreneur. So he made 3 transitions from niches, from wine to social media to the entrepreneur's entrepreneur. Like, he's up there with Tony Robbins now.
Brilliant.
Ellen DeGeneres, stand-up comic, sitcom, daytime talk show. Rachel Ray, 30-minute meals with Rachel, very specific cooking show, 30 minutes. Why? Because moms were coming home and they wanted something healthy for the kids, but they only had 30 minutes. So that show took off. Then she created other cooking shows. Now she's a daytime talk show brand. She's all things to all people, probably mostly female audience, but we know what they represent, if that makes sense. So what is the niche you're starting out and how are you going to expand outside of that niche?
I love it. Awesome. Brilliant stuff. All right. So I've got a bunch of friends that I've created, a lot of friendships I've created through the course of this podcasting adventure, a lot of others that are in the same podcasting space, and we're all trying to grow. And there's been quite a few that have jumped in during COVID. That's been one of the cool things about this nightmare that we've been living in, is to see people getting into the space. But one of the things that I was hoping to do, number one, because I think it builds community, but 2, obviously hoping for the opportunity to leverage some financial opportunities, a conglomeration of podcasts. What is your advice for doing that? Any pros, any cons? What are your thoughts on that?
So I'll give you a case study on how that works. So there's different kinds of networks that you could stream together. So what you're talking about is a group of independents that you stream together into what's called a network. That's a different kind of network. Everybody owns their own podcast, but you bring them together.
Okay.
So you could sell ad spaces en masse. That's usually what a conglomeration is.
That's kind of what I was hoping to do.
So you want to bond that together based on psychographics. So a really great case study is there's like 50, or even in the early days, there was a lot of Star Trek podcasts. There was like 50 of them. So some guy came together, someone like you, that's like, hey, why don't we all get together, all 50 of us, and I know where to sell. I'll go to the Comic Cons. I know who the vendors are that want to get in front of the Star Trek audience. I'll sell all 50 of us together as a block. We'll get a premium because we now control all listeners on podcasts for this niche. And that person, let's say, would sell the advertising. And let's say the one guy only has 100 downloads, but the big guy has 10,000. It would get a proportion by percentage of listeners is how the money would get proportioned, but everybody got paid. And then that person that would put the deals together would take 20% off the top as an ad agency, which is more than really 30% would probably be more fair, but he was even more fair, saying, hey, I'll only take 20. You guys keep all the other 80, gets a portion. Everybody wound up making money. And that was getting a conglomeration of the same kind of interest together. So that works. It's just you have to have everybody kind of delivering when you ask them to read the ads, and they got to agree on. It's just you got to get consensus, which takes time.
But you would recommend getting everybody in one niche as opposed to trying to cover a variety of different niches and trying to be a more diverse. Again,
yeah, because your advertiser is not going to go for that.
Advertisers want the niche stuff more.
The advertiser wants to know, okay, am I talking to a bunch of entrepreneurs, or are these entrepreneurs that want to get into YouTube? Like, how niche is it? And then the nichier, like before Podfest, I did an entrepreneurial community for business owners in Tampa. That was the largest in the whole area. And I still would have to beg people to pay for a booth where we would serve up 500 business owners, which it would never get that exposure anywhere else. Once I started Podfest, it was the only time in my life sponsors would call me up out of the blue to place ad dollars with me. And that's when I realized the power of a niche. There's not a lot of places for them to find active podcasters. So they were finding me. So that made my job a lot easier to sell.
Was that the only difference you felt like? It was just the fact that it was niche?
Yeah. Well, for the selling the ad space. Yeah.
Because I think of small business owners of Tampa. That feels pretty niche to me. I'm surprised.
It's not, because you're competing with every other group. So you're competing with the local chambers, which there's like
all the Chamber of Commerce.
There's like 40 of them. I'm not even exaggerating. It's got to be minimum 20, probably somewhere around 40. Then you're competing with Working Women Tampa Bay, which is even nicher. So she does really well, which not necessarily competing directly, but the ad dollars get split. So you got to figure out where they're going to. So, it's still a great niche and we'd make money, but you didn't get
nothing like what you're doing with Podfest for sure.
Well, you were stuck in, think of it this way. If you put an app in Apple's iTunes, most apps are 99 cents to $1.99 for back in the day, right? I don't know what they are now. But so I was in a very localized economy, so I couldn't even charge a lot, where now we're in an international space. We represent, we just had 46 countries at global. So who doesn't want that audience? And now you get to charge a premium. So Glenn the Geek, my buddy, always says, the riches are in the niches. That's his famous soundbite.
I love that one. That's one of my favorite ones. So I'm curious, one of the things I've been trying to do with the conglomeration of podcasts and trying to get into some of this, trying to get into the industry of podcasting. I'm trying to find more statistics, more information about our niche, our industry. And you are obviously kind of have an umbrella eye view of podcasting as a whole. Do you know good resources to get statistics, to get information, or how are you getting that information?
Daniel J. Lewis has the best stats. From what I heard, I think Rob Walsh mentioned him.
Daniel Day Lewis, isn't that an actor?
I think it's Daniel J. Lewis.
Yeah, Daniel J. Lewis. Okay.
Daniel Day Lewis. I'm pretty sure you did. So yes, I know it's crazy. So he
Last of the Mohicans or Last of the Podcasters?
I think he has podcast review sites.
Okay.
Podcast reviews. I would look that up, but he's got probably one of the most accurate places to get information. As far as what I understand, we have well over 1.5 million podcasters listed. Podcasters that have published within the last 90 days is something like 330,000. So there's not a lot of active podcasters. It's great that there's a lot of millions of people have started a podcast. Doesn't mean they're active. Of active podcasters, it's still a small number. It's about 330,000. That's why Podfest, remember, we have like 2,000 podcasters, the last live show. And now with the virtual, we had 5,000. That's literally like a percentage of 1 or 2% of all the active podcasters. So it's a big deal, because where are you going to get them all in one place?
That's amazing to think about. I mean, it's literally just the tip of the iceberg of what's really out there, of how much more reach that you have the potential to get and to have. I know we got to start winding this down because you've got other things and other commitments that you have to jump into. Want to just wrap it up with a couple of points or a couple of last minute things. Mastermind versus like a Facebook group, or even just a virtual group, or just a meeting of like-minded people. You see now it's like everybody's got their mastermind and everybody wants you to pay to have this thing. What do you see as the difference and the value of each or the other?
So like when you're talking so when it comes to mastermind, I can't go into deep detail because I have such a volume of information. I don't want to overwhelm I've sold 2 masterminds. I'm one of the few people actually created 2 different masterminds and sold them as a commodity, which is very rare.
That is
So
rare. That's amazing.
I get really into masterminds, and there's an account, like we could go into deep dives. There's accountability masterminds. There's the Socratic method masterminds. There's experience share type masterminds. There's best practice masterminds. So I've been part of a lot, and so what people don't realize, masterminds have been around. They're called, in the business circles, if you're talking to CEOs, they don't even know the word mastermind. They call them peer groups. And there's groups like Vistage. They charge, I don't know, $2,000 a month, but it's nothing, because they're dealing with CEOs that you have to do 5 or 10 million a year in revenue or more to be in those groups. There's Renaissance Executive Forums. There's C12, which is a Christian mastermind. So there's a lot, like professionalized masterminds globally. Then you have influencers, which what you're talking about, creating their own masterminds. And those are phenomenal as well. I'm a big supporter of masterminds. The challenge with them, and here's what I would tell you if I were to look at a 10,000 view, not getting into the details of how they run, I've trained facilitators for masterminds. You need a strong facilitator. So that, Nate, that would usually be you or whoever's in charge of the mastermind putting it together. And then you need the right kind of players. So they have to be strong players, and you want them to be around the same size class or bigger. So you can't, if you have like people starting out, for instance, they haven't started their podcast, that's not a mastermind. If you put those people in a group, that's a coaching group, because you're coaching them how to get started. But now if it's someone like you that started their podcast, that's a mastermind, because now they need to share ideas, best practices, because now they're in the thick of it and trying to figure things out. So those individuals could be put together. Now, if we get podcasters that are doing 1 million downloads or more an episode, that's a whole different level of mastermind, because their needs are so different. They're probably dealing with a handful of employees. They're dealing with ad agencies. They're dealing with networks courting them. So it all depends. The main thing is you need to get rid of negative thinkers. Negativity, I don't care what masterminds, does not survive in a mastermind, because those people shoot down everybody else's ideas and they're not happy with themselves. So you got to actually interview people and listen to their thought process. If they're negative, they cannot join a mastermind. Right now I'm in I put together a 2-week accelerator course, and a lot of them wanted to know if it was a mastermind. And I explained to them, this is an accelerator accountability course where you set goals and get them done for 2 weeks. I take masterminding very seriously. I've been part of groups for 15 years now, actively masterminding, but it all comes down to who's in your group and how strong are the players.
That's great. So I want to create not a group, but an event. I've got a buddy who has a whitewater rafting outfit out in Utah or out in Idaho. It's Snake River.
So that's a mastermind retreat. Those are a lot of fun. And I've done those. Those are amazing. I will give you a little hack. Let's say you charge 5 or 10 grand for something like that, because usually that's what they go for. Okay. If you could figure out how to pay for, let's say, the cabins for the 3 nights, like get a group deal, what happens is the people attending your mastermind, because you took some of that money to pay for the cabins, they didn't have to worry about their room nights. They're already happier, and they're more likely to re-up for your next go around, because don't ask me why, but it's a less stress. You put them all together and you'll have that's probably the highest retention you'll ever get.
Well, this is a point to point, so it's all inclusive. That's like they've got the other gear that they raft you down. And my biggest question is I've picked out a couple of individuals I think would be a good fit, and how to get the right speakers and the right guys, and just to bring the synergy, bring it all together, and to really just how to execute it, because I've just never done anything like that.
So yeah, when you say point to point, I hope you're not paying for their airfare.
No. When I say point, like you get in the river at point A, and then everything gets shipped down the river, all those supplies, everything, and it's a couple-day trip. And
so for speakers, you don't that kind of trip, you don't really need. That's not about the speakers. It's actually about the experience and then the camaraderie. So
I was hoping to create both.
Yeah, no, you can't. What I'm saying is, you can create both, but you don't have to stress yourself out about the speakers. Meaning, it doesn't. If you get a decent speaker that has what I would do with those things is I get a speaker that has a really good point that I want to hammer home throughout the whole experience, like a one topic speaker. And then if someone, you or someone that's part of your faculty has a really good presentation. Between those two things, that way you don't have to knock yourself out. Because I've done it where we have to fly in speakers. It was a pain in the ass. So it just, and you're paying the speakers, which you should pay them. But what I realize is half the time is if we could find a good speaker that live local to the area and they could drive out, it would save us a lot of money in expenses.
Yeah. So my thought was to provide the experience for the speaker and like in a significant other or a whatever.
Yeah, if you get them to agree, that'd be awesome.
Yeah.
The challenge is they're only speaking once, right?
Yeah. Well, okay. My idea was to have like 2 or 3, like a Ryan Holiday type or a Tim Ferriss type or whatever. That's their draw is to have the experience because again, this is an experience. People come out from Hollywood to go do this or whatever. That's what his niche is, my buddy. But then it's to like get them out there, but then have other, other influential people that would benefit from their presentation that have the money to then want to pay for. You're getting the experience of the rapids, then you're getting the speaker, and you're all encompassed. So you're all kind of in one big group, so it's not like it's just the speaker, but you're actually one-on-one. You're all going through the same adventure together, kind of thing.
Yeah, I it's highly unlikely, only because they charge $50,000 to $100,000. Okay. So just so you know where they're at in the marketplace, they're at the higher end, so they probably won't do it. That's why I'm telling you, if you could find a really good speaker that's local to the area, they might do it. I like finding really good authors around a book that maybe is popular. When I say popular, it's sold 1,000 or 5,000 copies. That's a great book, undervalued. So it's when you're looking for speakers, think about it as like baseball cards. You're looking for the undervalued baseball card that could oversize their value. So when you go for like Neil deGrasse Tyson, the astrophysicist, he's $100,000. I mean, sure. He's like, just to give you a frame reference of how much. Gary Vee is like 150, so for them, I get that you're selling them on the experience, but right. they make millions. They could go wherever they want.
Yeah. And those are the dream shots. I mean, I would try to.
No, but Ryan Holiday is a great pick. I mean, that's a great. I don't know what he goes for, to be honest with you. I know Tim's.
His value's probably going down here lately.
Why, he did something?
He's just acting. I don't want to get into.
He's getting political, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just that's when people, when they start taking turns on the political sphere, they go down.
It's tough. Yeah. All right. So Chris, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for. I've got so much more that I want to dive into, but I know you've got to run to the next one. So we'll wrap this thing up. If you had a billboard for all the world to see, what would you put on that? And then the last question is, what's your favorite item under $100 that you use on an everyday basis that you could not live without?
The headphones that I have on me right now.
Oh, you got that one so easy. Most people have to think about that one for a while.
Yeah, no, that's easy. I use it every day. And
tell me what's the brand, what's the make, what's the model? Give me the lowdown.
Oh, these are Cowins. I don't know what the model is, but Cowin, Cowin. I think they're like $59. They're just a great value, and with Amazon, it's got thousands of reviews. I would either say that or my microphone, which I use every day. But the headphones save me because at home, my wife is one of those people that she hears every sound. Some people are light sleepers. And if I'm watching something on my phone, these headphones save my marriage. So it keeps everybody peaceful,
Keep you from getting divorced. That's great. I love it.
Keeps peace in the house. She's happy.
Talk about value, right?
Yeah, talk about value, right? So that's the value for me. As far as what would be on a billboard, probably something to do with wildlife. I'm a big wildlife guy. I love going out in the country. And it would probably be something that would make us think about how we pollute or how we use resources. So a lot of people don't realize, but they make fun of, I'm not a hunter, but they make fun of hunters. But a lot of my friends are hunters. They like preserving the outdoors because they spend more time in the outdoors than most people. So you'd be amazed at how many allies you could get cross spectrum to keep preserving. Like recently so it'd be something about wildlife, maybe rhinos. Recently the northern black rhino is extinct now. Like, how big a rhino is for it to go extinct. So I'm big on conservation. And I think unfortunately for these animals, we need to step up and support them and save their save the resources that's left, because I'm afraid there's not going to be much left in the near future.
Well, that's a perfect note to end on. My buddy Corey Lockman was one of my early guests on the show, and he has the Wildlife Federation Fund, and he goes out there and spends time in Africa every year taking care of the rhinos specifically. So,
and it would be neat just to end it on this, because I'm a big parrot. I love parrots. Like, I'm a big parrot. Like, I have parrot encyclopedias. But it would be smart conservation. So here's an example. The challenge is, the African gray parrot is the most popular parrot. It's the one that talks the most. People love it. Everybody's got a story about it. Oh, this gray parrot with the red tail. Recently, I think it was the World Parrot Foundation, whatever the acronym is. They outlawed the shipping. They made it like CITES 1. So they made it critically where you can't ship African grays. The challenge is South Africa had the largest breeding population captive, and they were shipping these birds to China. The moment they outlawed all these legitimate breeders, the trappers in the rainforest now we're going down from 5 million wild African grays to 1 within a couple of years. Because now, instead of they played politics, now all the wild African grays are about to disappear because there's no more breeders and satiating the demand in China. So there's in other words, I'd love to have smart conservation. You know what I mean? Once we know that the rainforests and people aren't pillaging, maybe then we could move things, but you got to be smart about it. So politically, the group looked really good at what they did, but what they just did was they signed the death warrant of this beautiful parrot in the wild, which I'm not for.
Yeah, and it's similar to like how they've dealt with some of the wildlife forest fires in California over the years. It's good intentions that didn't really work out the way they were meant to.
Yeah, you just need to manage. I mean, in the Southeast, I walk in the woods a lot, and you'll see the park rangers do control fires, control burns, and you're like, "What are you guys doing?" And they're like, "Oh, we're just burning this area to make sure the brush." And it looks kind of scary, but it's great because this Florida, Georgia, we'd go up like a matchstick if they didn't do it.
Oh yeah,
because it gets so dry out in the sticks here that you could literally have half the state burn overnight.
yeah, and we're so blessed to live in a place where they do manage it so well, and they do. And like my local park guys are just I know them by name because I'm out there so much. So kudos to them and the job that they're doing. They're underserved. They don't make any kind of money, and their work is just never ending. But they do an amazing job. So kudos to all those guys for that. Chris, thank you so much for your time. Like I said, I've got so much more I really want to get into it with you, Bon, but maybe the opportunity will present itself again in the future. But excited for the future of PodFest, the future of this industry, and the future for Chris and all that you have coming up, because I know if you're up to something, then we're in good hands, man. So thank you.
Thank you, Nate.
Well, take care. So you're still here. Wow. Thanks for sticking around. So, what'd you think? What did I miss? What would you like to know more about? Who would you like to hear on the show? If you stuck around this long, maybe you won't mind giving me some feedback. And don't forget to check out the website, extraordinarypodcast.net, for all the latest episodes. And if you enjoyed the show, please take the time to share with your friends, on social media, or with anyone you think who might enjoy it. And last but not least, if you're ready to start living an extraordinary life, check out 8keystogreat.com, where you can craft your free blueprint to renovate your career, home, or lifestyle. The program is free, but you have to do the work to unlock each key. And finally, if you'd like to speak with me directly, you can book a free 30-minute Zoom call directly through my Calendly link on the contacts page. And in the meantime, check out some of the other exciting interviews with ordinary people living extraordinary lives. Thanks for listening, thanks for sharing, and most of all, thanks for just being you. I'm Nate G, and we'll see you next week.